right. Well, we got quite a few joining. I know several others may join here in the next few minutes, but I'd like to go ahead and get started. Wanted to thank everybody for joining our webinar today. My name is Brendan Wheeler. I'm the Vice President for the Greater Fort Worth section. And before we get started, I just wanted to let everyone know that this session is being recorded. We will have the recording available, but just so you know that you're joining a recorded session. As we've done for the past several months, this is another joint meeting between the Greater Dallas and Greater Fort Worth sections. We're excited to be joined by Julia Ryan with the City of Fort Worth, who is a presenter for today's meeting. If you have any questions during the presentation, please feel free to type them in the Q&A box. We prefer in the Q&A box rather than the chat box if possible. And at the end of the webinar, we'll have time for Julia to respond to your questions. So before we introduce Julia, let's run through some section business items first. First, I'd like to thank the Fort Worth section sponsors for sponsoring our website and efforts throughout the year. That's BGE, Kimley Horn, LAN, Pacheco Coke, Paradigm Traffic Systems, and Pelco. So we appreciate all that you guys do for us. And just an update on the Fort Worth section bank account. Our checking account is sitting at just over $1,800, and our savings just eclipsed $10,000. So I vote we have some sort of party now that we've passed $10,000 in our savings account. Anyway, so without further ado, let me introduce Aaron, who's representing the district and has some announcements related to the webinar series that the district is doing. Aaron?
Thanks so much. So hopefully everyone who is a TechSite member has news at techsite.org saved to their Outlook contacts or whatever email system you use, because we are sending out our important announcements through that. One of those that went out last week was our 2021 webinar series. Because our spring meeting was canceled, we still want to provide PDH opportunities to the members and also provide an opportunity for those who submitted abstracts for our spring meeting to still present, even though we're not having it. And so we've broken that into monthly webinars, and information about each of those webinars, including the registration information, will be sent out via email, and it'll also be posted on techsite.org. You can navigate to that webinar page by going to techsite.org/webinar webinars plural 2021, and we'll make sure you can get to that easily from the home page. We'll be making some updates here shortly. But our first webinar is going to be in April. It will be on the 29th, starting at noon and ending at 1:30. And the topic will be new technologies in transportation. And we will have some of our vendor speakers there talking about some of their technologies that they have. So we encourage everyone to join. Make sure that you do register and keep checking our website for updates as well as your email. And I will pass it off to Joseph to talk about additional announcements.
Thanks, Aaron. And I look forward for Dallas's opportunity in May to do our presentation, helping out that web series. Hi, I'm Joseph Marchione. I'm the current president of the Dallas section, but I'm also going to be the 2021 Fall Joint TechSite ITS Texas Fall Meeting that's going to be happening here in November. November will hopefully come up on us very quickly. We are still planning an in-person meeting here in Dallas. So what I need from the Dallas staff or the Dallas membership is some volunteers for our LAC committees. If you are interested in volunteering, if you have my email, you can go ahead and email me directly. If you don't have my email, go ahead and send an email to dallas@techsite.org. That's dallas@techsite.org. Let me know your interest in working with the LAC this year. I know last year we did the Denton one, and this year we're doing this one. So hopefully a lot of those skills that we learned last year we can use again this year. So if you have any questions or concerns or something like that, just go ahead and email either myself or the Dallas@textile.org, and we will work with you. In terms of our budgets, our scholarship is currently at $8,662.23, and our general fund is at $4,941.78. So those are our only announcements for Dallas. So go back to Brendan for our introduction of our speaker.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Aaron. So let's get into our presentation for today. The title of today's webinar is From Policy to Action, Making the Case for Complete Streets. Our speaker today is Julia Ryan, is the first Complete Streets Program Manager for the City of Fort Worth. Julia has been with the city for 14 years and has worked extensively on transportation policy issues such as complete streets, thoroughfare planning, active transportation, access management, pedestrian safety, and planning, design, and implementation of bicycle facilities. Julia recently authored the Complete Streets Implementation Plan for Fort Worth that outlines process improvements to integrate complete streets into standard practice. She also managed the adoption of a data-driven, equity-based active transportation plan and is working towards a comprehensive sidewalk policy. Julia earned a dual bachelor's degree from Iowa State University in political science and environmental studies and a master's degree from Eastern Michigan University in urban and regional planning. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to Julia.
Thank you very much. So you should all see my screen now. So good afternoon, and thank you for having me today at the...
We do not see your screen yet.
Oh. Is that fun?
Brendan, can you make sure that, oh, there it goes.
There it goes. All right, so again, thank you for having me today at your lunch meeting, and welcome to the City of Fort Worth. These are some iconic scenes around the city that I'm sure you've seen before or familiar with. We're the 13th largest city in the country. We have a lot of room left to grow, so we're probably going to move up over the next several years to higher and higher numbers. And so proper planning is appropriate for making sure that we build the city the way it should be. So, but too many places in the city look like this. So we have wide roads with excess capacity. We have places where no one is crossing. There's poor planning and implementation of our transportation networks. There's uncomfortable and unused bicycle facilities. And then just not understanding the land use context of where you're putting facilities. So some of the impetus for the planning efforts that we've done, there are many, but these are really the basic transportation planning philosophies and principles that we've used to build these planning efforts and implementation efforts. So first, and we'll go through these in more detail as we go through the presentation, but racial equity disparities, and this is something that's been discovered in Fort Worth in terms of transportation funding and also in fatal and incapacitating crashes. And so we know that the areas where there's a minority population have a disproportionate amount of exposure to these kinds of crashes and fatalities. Our roadways weren't compatible with the land use, and so our thoroughfare plan in the past was functional classification. So it didn't matter if you were building a roadway inside an urban area or a suburban area, you would end up with the same road, and so that's not appropriate for all situations. A lot of the planned roadway capacity exceeded the traffic need, and I'll talk about that as we go through. And then there's the concept of Vision Zero, so the idea that no traffic fatalities are acceptable. And then finally, our multimodal plans were not well integrated into our other planning processes or documents. So I wanted to make sure that those were all saying the same thing. So we really began our planning efforts in 2010 and have progressed as we've gone along throughout each year. And so these are the plans that have been adopted in the years they've been adopted, as well as the pedestrian crash counts and severities. So the bike plan in 2010 was really our springboard for all of the other things that we did after that. So in 2019, we updated our Unified Fort Worth Plan, so our vision of active transportation plan. And as you can see, the numbers are increasing, but the last couple of years they have decreased, and that is a slight anomaly nationally. So we don't really know if these policies are having an impact or not, but we should hopefully be able to see some of the effects of our labors, again, over the next 5 years as we continue to build and implement these policies. So moving into complete streets, what are they? It's really about designing the roadways for people who are going to use them. And it's important to note that not every road is going to look the same, and not every road is going to serve the same people. So we want to make sure that we're optimizing each street for the people that it serves. For example, you wouldn't optimize freight travel on a residential street and vice versa. So those are the things we really look at with complete streets, as well as the context sensitivity. Again, we'll talk about that. Now, complete streets are important at Fort Worth for a number of reasons, and these are reasons that are relevant across the Metroplex. Things like population growth, obesity, and equity, aging, road fatalities. These are all things that are prevalent in the entire Metroplex. So this is something that the whole region could get behind and support. So I get a lot of questions about complete streets and context sensitivity. So they're really different but similar. And so when you look at the complete streets policy, so that's your policy that says you're going to provide transportation options for all users. It's really that policy that sets the framework for what you should build. Now, your context sensitivity comes into play when you're actually implementing. So as you can see in the transect image and the example of a bicycle facility, as it moves through each of those land use transects, it changes. So in your natural zones, you start with a trail, and then as you continue to go in, your facility changes. And that's really the application of complete streets and context sensitivity. So there is a distinction between the two. Now, I know a lot of people, when they think of complete streets, that they think, oh, every street with a bike lane is a complete street, or we have to put bike lanes in for a complete street. And you see, this is what happens when you don't take that context into building complete streets. This is a major arterial with a lot of traffic, a lot of fast traffic, a lot of school kids going across. You can see the school bus, and we have a narrow bike lane, a sidewalk that's right next to it, walls that are right next to that. And you don't get that comfort factor. And that happens when you don't take the context into the design of the road. Now, our master thoroughfare plan, generally, these are your arterials in your major roadways. And so what we did is we took the master thoroughfare plan, and I'll walk through this in the next couple slides about how we took the thoroughfare plan and changed it to actually implement the things that we wanted to implement. And so using land use and using our build out model for the entire network helped us to build a better master thoroughfare plan. So the goals of this thoroughfare plan, this was adopted in 2016. It's rooted in complete streets and context sensitivity. So those were the main tenets. Now, the other thing that we wanted to look at was fiscal stewardship, so right-sizing the roads. And I'll talk to you a little bit about how we did this. It's a really interesting outcome and an example of actually one of the roadways that has been constructed that can demonstrate that fiscal stewardship. The other thing about right-sizing your roadways, your maintenance burden in the future is reduced, so you don't have to maintain as much of that concrete. So our context-sensitive thoroughfares, if you're familiar with thoroughfare planning, it's usually functional classification. So you've got your major, minor, and your principal arterials, and those define the number of lanes that are on that roadway. So we threw that out, and we moved to a street type system, which is a land use-based classification system. And so we organized the city into different land use categories or street types. So we have our streets, which are our urban mixed-use areas. Our connectors are your more suburban, either neighborhood areas or in commercial areas. And then there's the regional links, so those sort of TxDOT fast-paced roads. And so we're looking at the different elements within each of those street types, and they change based on a number of different characteristics, such as the speed of the roadway or the number of lanes. So we built in the context sensitivity into our thoroughfare plan so that we were able to get the right facility for each roadway network. Now our build out model, this was a tailored version of the COGS 2035 model, and we added in build out projections. So in these high growth areas of the city and ETJ, we didn't use the fiscally constrained part of the model, but we wanted to be aggressive with the number of lanes that we were projecting. And so being fiscally strategic with our land resources as well, you don't want to have a 130-foot right-of-way roadway when you really only need 110 foot, because now you've lost those 20 feet of tax ability for the life of the project. And so you want to make sure that you're being strategic about how wide the road is and where it is. But we also wanted to make sure that we were conservative in the fact that we needed to provide enough capacity. So in the example on the map, we actually added a network node to distribute the capacity of the network. So there wasn't enough capacity in the area and we were blowing out certain roadways. So we actually did go in and add some roadways. And this allowed us to evaluate, the network capacity rather than individual roadway capacity, because we're building a thoroughfare plan, not a thoroughfare. So moving on to active transportation plan. This plan was adopted in 2019, and it was built on those foundations of the master thoroughfare plan and moving towards a more comfortable and context-sensitive transportation network. So we built it on top of that land use-based facilities. So just an introduction to comfort. We all know about comfort, but when you're talking about assigning a comfort level to engineering design, it takes a little bit more data. And so it's often, as it says, an intangible. So when I say something is comfortable, that's often subjective. But when you can actually apply a data analysis and look at the data to show exactly what's comfortable and what's uncomfortable, that helps you to provide a better facility and a better experience for those who are using it. Now I like to use this because this is Pompeii. And so the first sidewalks have been around for a long time, and day doesn't go by when I don't talk about why we need sidewalks. And so when we think about designing roadways, we tend to think about just the immediate decisions that are being made in terms of cost or right-of-way. We don't often think about those long-term decisions. And so roadways and the rights-of-way can last 20, 50 years more. And the development patterns are set by those right-of-way lines. So the interesting thing that I find about that is, in Boston, there's cobblestone streets that date to the 1600s that they think were actually laid out by the Puritans. And it's important to note because these streets are so long-lasting that decisions that are made today, even on something simple as curb placement or where trees can be planted or where to put the utility boxes, anything like that, can actually negatively impact the ability to provide comfortable facilities, over the next 50 years. And so that may not be something that you immediately see in your work now, but it's something we see on roads that were constructed 50 years ago. So our streets are our most ubiquitous public spaces. And when you design for drivers, this is from the pedestrian point of view. This is a great cartoon that really shows the experience of what it's like as a pedestrian, either in your urban area or your suburban area. And so these areas have really been constructed around the vehicle, and we've lost a lot of that public space that we used to have that were part of our communities. So when we identify factors to actually assign an experience level, a pedestrian comfort level to a roadway, there's a lot of things that we can look at. And so a lot of it is really based on the data you have. And so a lot of this was data we had. And it's pretty intuitive. So is there a sidewalk in the condition? Is the speed limit lower next to the sidewalk. That's obviously a more favorable environment for walking. Number of lanes, again, a favorable experience when there's less number of lanes. And then the last two are sort of different. So whether there's a bike lane or parking. And what we decided was that these things, when they're present, can help reduce the amount of space that a driver is from the sidewalk and can help actually make the comfort better. So especially with on-street parking, that it provides that buffer, that physical separation from the sidewalk. And so we decided that those were important principles to include as well. So this is an output of what that data looks like. Obviously, red's bad, green is good. And we can easily look at this and see which areas have the poor infrastructure just based on the colors. So you've got segments and there's also intersections. So just pulling this out, this is Seminary Roadway in Fort Worth. And so looking at this area, it may be hard to see, but you're looking at, no sidewalks along the cross streets. There's no stop control for people going across the street. There's residential on both sides. There's restaurants on both sides. There's a transit facility. And so there's ample opportunity for people to need to cross the road, but they can't. And so the comfort of people going from north to south or south to north is really going to be hindered by those lack of facilities, especially if you're a person with a disability. Now, for bicyclist comfort, a lot of our infrastructure is really designed for a professional athlete rather than the everyday user. And so these types of facilities absolutely have to be based on context and not a prescribed design. Otherwise you get, maybe something that looks like that. So, most of the facilities, again, like I said, are built for those confident and athletic riders. So you see the 2% of people willing to use a less comfortable facility. So that would be a shared lane situation, a narrow bike lane with a lot of traffic, and then you move up. And most people would prefer to be on a separate facility. So you'll see on the right, 36% would prefer to use a wide sidewalk, shared use path, side path, whichever the terminology you use. And so these are the things that if we want to encourage people to use the facilities and be able to get to transit, to school, exercise, those are the things that we need to construct in areas where we have a lot of traffic and high-speed traffic. So for the bicycle level of traffic stress, we can also assign a comfort value to bicycle stress. And so looking at the segment, so this is along the road, you're looking at things that negatively impact the stress, such as the speed of traffic, a lot of lanes, a lot of turning traffic, high traffic volumes. But the presence of a comfortable bike facility can reduce that, but in some cases, not enough. So even your on-street facilities may not be enough to appropriately address the comfort. So this is the facility selection table that we developed as part of the active transportation plan. And it takes, again, that master thoroughfare plan, land use, street type, so the system lengths, the connectors, the streets, and then takes the different variables as part of the posted speed, the number of lanes, the total vehicle traffic, and assigns a specific comfort value. So a 1 is going to be a comfortable environment across the board. And as you continue to go through, you'll see that, if you even think about putting a buffered bike lane with physical protection on a system length that's a 45-mile-an-hour roadway, you're going to quickly lose a lot of comfort. And so, unfortunately, this is a common practice, not just in Fort Worth, but across the country. And it's really that concept of giving up at the intersection. And so we built this really great level of traffic stress 2 buffered bike lane on a slower street with less traffic. And then we gave up at the intersection. And so we didn't want to affect any of the congestion or the capacity of the intersection. And so we just dropped it. And this is at an interstate. So what you end up happening is that you've basically taken this level of traffic stress 2 roadway and made it all a level of traffic stress 4, Because if you're not willing to bike on a facility like this, then you're not going to bike on the facility at all. So we need to make sure that we're looking at those intersections and seeing how we can pull those through if that's really what our priorities are. And so moving on to racial equity, this is something that's gained a lot of attention over the last couple of years, and it's a great thing because this has been something that has been needed to be talked about for a long time. And so transportation equity, the fairness with which transportation costs and benefits are distributed. And I can't leave this slide without recommending a book by Richard Rothstein called The Color of Law, and it really talks about how historic racism has shaped modern cities to be inequitable, and so lower investments in critical infrastructure like lights, streetlights, sidewalks, transit can lead to inequitable transportation networks and have long-lasting effects. And it also goes into things like housing policy and redlining, which is something that it should be openly discussed and mitigated as we move forward. So in 2020, these were our crash locations. And so you can see them, this is just our central city. Scattered, it looks like there's a pattern, which there is. And so these blue areas are what we call our super majority minority areas. These are 75% majority minority communities. And they house a very disproportionate share of the pedestrian and bicycle crash and fatalities. So they're dying at a higher rate in these areas because of these issues. And so the reliance on public transportation and access to healthcare and facilities, these are areas where there's also persons with disabilities living, and then younger and older than 64. And so there can be higher costs of transportation and lower uses of personal transportation. So for the active transportation plan, we wanted to make sure that we included equity as a major part of the score for our sidewalks. So 40% of the score of our sidewalks are in areas where we have a high percentage of persons with disabilities, majority minority communities, and zero-car households. So these were really important. And then as we were having the discussion, there was some concern that maybe the crash history should have been higher. But what you end up with is because there's such a disproportionate share of crashes in these areas, you're sort of double dipping. And it's really a good thing because we want to focus our efforts on those areas where the people are getting hit and are getting killed. So making the case for these kinds of things. So flipping the script, and really this is applicable when you're going to public meetings and talking to the public and trying to anticipate what the concerns may be in the specific community. So in some cases it's congestion, vehicular speed or noise, putting in a bike facility where there may not be any users, or removal of on-street parking. And then tailoring those concerns to the goals of the project. So this is a public meeting slide that I put together that talks about the concerns that the neighborhood had and really flipped that script. And so we were talking about, buffering the pedestrians from the roadway, increasing the number of painted crosswalks, reducing the pedestrian crossing distance. And so by flipping that script and really anticipating what some concerns are you can begin to move that conversation in a more positive direction. And then fiscal stewardship, this is obviously something everybody can get on board with, and that, the update of our 2016 Master Thoroughfare Plan, we had a lot of future 6-lane roadways on there that, based on our modeling, weren't necessary. And so being explicit about what your goals are can help to reduce some of that friction. So with a really large infrastructure need and a limited budget, we need to make sure that we're budgeting these things wisely. And so building a 6-lane arterial is going to be a really hard sell, really costly sell. versus a 4-lane arterial, which will likely be more adequate for, say, a neighborhood or the context that it's in based on that build-out model. And then it also takes, that property that would have been right-of-way forever and puts it back into the tax rolls. So, and I just did this back of a napkin analysis, and this was based on a roadway that was planned previously to 2016 as a 110-foot 4-lane divided thoroughfare with a median. And our city modeling showed that we only really needed an 8-foot cross-section, so 1 lane per direction. So a developer came in and constructed this. They constructed the whole facility, which was nearly 2,000 feet of this roadway, the whole thing. And by reducing the right-of-way to what we actually needed, the developer saved 1.3 acres of right-of-way, dedication and construction, which is pretty big when you talk about maximizing the economic benefit and giving back land to developers to be able to tax. And so on the city side, we reduced the future concrete maintenance by 30%. So we took 30% of that future concrete out. We reduced the annual median maintenance, so those mowing needs, by an acre. So we took out an acre. And then we can, again, this is back of a napkin analysis, collect more than $3 million of taxable value over 30 years. And so that's, real outcomes that are based on actual data-driven decisions that if you're doing it right, you can actually show the value of these things to people who may not be completely in support of what you're trying to do. And so when we plan for the right things, the transportation network works well, and the end users, the drivers and pedestrians and bicyclists and transit users can reap those benefits. And then the city can also do that same thing by, lowering the roadway maintenance, more taxable property, things like that. And so stepping back from our tight focus on our individual project and understanding what the implications are for each of those decisions that we make are, we can move that needle towards moving forward towards a more appropriate and context-sensitive network. So are we nailing these things every time? No, but we have the tools in place now to ensure that success in the future. And so in wrapping out, the lessons learned, equity, I can't stress this enough, it's very important. Consider starting meetings with what can I do to improve racial equity through my work, especially if you're working in areas where you have a majority minority community or have been systematically oppressed through racism. Changing policies takes a long time, and it's easy to lose focus and think that nothing is changing. But looking back, you can see that you have made progress and you have done things. So it can be frustrating in the short term, but focus on those incremental changes and just know where you've been and where you can go. Again, tailoring your audience is really important again. And then last but not least, this is something we've learned over and over again, that you can adopt policies and plans all day, but if you don't have a plan to change your process, then it's going to have a really difficult time being able to be incorporated by your staff. And so with that, I am happy to take any questions or comments.
Thanks, Julia. It was a great presentation. Does anybody have any questions for Julia? We can unmute your mic, and if you don't want to type it in, you can do it verbally. I noticed we did have a note, Julia, by Kirk Hauser in the Q&A box that the Romans had used those raised stones to keep you from having to step in the sewage running down the street. That's pretty helpful, I'm sure. Okay, it looks like we have a question from Steve Carver. Steve asks, regardless of location, crash type, or severity? Are there statistics to indicate whether driver distraction was a major factor, i.e. cell phone usage?
So I haven't delved into a lot of the data, but I think probably not as prevalent as you would think. There are more statistics that show that people of color are going to be hit in a crosswalk than white people. And so those are some of the things that, you know, have been coming out lately is more of those kinds of statistics. I think distraction does play a role, but I think it's probably less of a role than most would think.
Okay. I noticed too, John Stanley asked the book recommendation title, and I believe Brian Schamberger responded, "The Color of Law, A Forgotten History of How Our Government Segregated America." Is that what you're referring to? Okay. All right. Next question is from Jennifer Butcher. Have you had any issues with developers or staff who want the bigger road for faster speeds and fought right sizing?
Yes, I would say that I don't know that the concern is faster speed. I would say that the processes that have been broken in the development of roadways, in terms of, you know, we still have our old cross sections as part of our design details, and so that can cause some problems as it relates to the construction. And so some will just pull that off and start designing, and, you know, by the time we get to a critical path, you know, they've designed too far and it's difficult to turn back. And so we're trying to remedy some of those things by updating those design details and those cross sections so that we make sure that everybody's building the same thing.
Great, thank you. Dusan Jelovich asked, any research on if the local communities are supportive of complete streets and road diets?
Well, yeah, I'll answer that from Fort Worth, and I would say yes. I think that the vision of Fort Worth is to provide those facilities across the city. I think the question comes down to, and the thing that, you know, still being figured out is how do we do that, and how do you balance the modality when there are competing interests? And so, you know, that's, you know, who gets priority if there's limited space, kind of a question. And so for Fort Worth, I think that's the biggest question we have is prioritizing those users.
Sure, absolutely. Okay. You had referred earlier to this, and I think Barin Barks is following up with this question here. Just curious how many more or how more minorities would be hit than white people in say, a crosswalk?
So there's been some studies, and I can't recall off the top of my head what the exact percentage was, but it was something like, you know, 60-30 around there, maybe even 70%. So, you know, it's not an insignificant amount of users.
Okay.
But there's several studies out there that can be looked at.
All right. Another question in the Q&A box here from Josh Smith. Can you tell us more about how the pedestrian level of comfort scores are being used to drive funding or design decisions?
Yeah, so the pedestrian experience was actually incorporated into the prioritization. And so we've prioritized all the sidewalk apps in the city that we had data for. And so that was part of that prioritization. And so in areas where, and these are probably more urban areas, as we relate to a more comfortable pedestrian experience, that those with lower scores, comfort scores, you know, bumped up the pedestrian prioritization score. So where there were sidewalk apps.
That's a great question. If I could kind of follow up with that, I thought the scoring system was really ingenious, and curious where you're seeing some more of those put in place, those kind of facilities? Is it more with new construction, say up north where it's growing so fast, or on the west side, or also used in reconstruction projects throughout the city? Where are you guys seeing that used more often than not?
So I think that the easiest answer is where the development is happening, because that's pretty much a blank slate and we can get what we need in those areas. I think it's a lot more difficult. And again, it goes back to the question about prioritizing users on a facility. And so, that's, again, something we need to iron out is, where we're looking at, reconstruction projects or other things where there is a concern about prioritizing pedestrians over, say, drivers, that those scores are utilized to be able to make those decisions.
Awesome. Okay. Good. We have a couple more questions here. Let's see. Mark Mathis asked, has Fort Worth looked at Austin's effort to provide bike facilities on all roadways classified as a connector or above?
I would say no. I know that Austin has a different kind of population density, and so it makes it a little difficult to be able to incorporate, the stuff from Austin. Nobody wants to be Austin in North Texas, but mostly for those connectors that we have, those connectors that are being constructed. So it's going to be the workhorse thoroughfare of the city in your suburban, commercial, and residential areas, is that side path. And we've really found that that's the most popular facility because you're looking at families, rather than commuters in these areas. And so that's really, it's an easy answer, and it's also a more fiscally sound answer because you don't have the additional maintenance cost on the roadway bed of that reinforced concrete.
Sure, that makes sense. Question from Daniel Herrig. How does Fort Worth approach roadway retrofit situations where there is not room for the ideal high comfort facility, i.e. choosing to install a minimum facility or nothing?
Yeah, that's it.
$1 million question.
$1 million question. So I guess I would say, do we have a great process? No. And it's really something that we have to do on a case-by-case basis. And sometimes it's a political decision and sometimes it's not. And I don't know if I could come up with an answer that would be appropriate for all situations. And I think the answer would change every time, even if you had a different, the same project in a different year, just because of the different things that are happening. And so, I mean, that's really a terrible non-answer, but it's a really difficult question that really just depends.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. Well, and kind of expanding on that question, I really appreciated how you pointed out some bike facilities stop right at the at an intersection, and they, you just expected to enter with traffic. I have a situation like that near my house. What are your and I guess this kind of goes to your design guide. In those kind of cases, what does the design guide recommend at the intersection? Is it widening of the intersection? Is it pulling the bike facility off the intersection to cross? How does that typically work?
Yeah, and I think it really depends on what your right turning traffic is doing. So we've done a couple of different things, and we're actually in the process of designing a protected intersection. But the things that we've done, we've pulled the bike lane through the intersection, which if you have a lot of right turning vehicles, will just use that to turn, which again sort of takes out that comfort level. My preference would be moving it into the pedestrian area. So if you do have a bike ramp, and this is, more not in a super urban downtown environment, but maybe a, more suburban-y urban kind of environment where you can get off of the road, merge onto a wide path, and then cross as a pedestrian, with specialized, obviously, restrictions on turning vehicles and things like that. But
sure.
you know, it's such a new thing for practitioners to be able to look at the intersection in more detail and to actually have to make the hard decisions, which is what this would be. And, you know, who gets, again, priority. And that's really a policy and political decision with your city. And it's going to depend on all the things happening on your road. So if it's high capacity transit or right next to a trail facility that people want to get to or things like that, those are things that, you know, you would take into account when you're doing those designs.
Sure. That makes sense. Well, good. I don't see any other questions, but I do see a comment here by Doug, so I'll just go ahead and read it out. Great presentation and illustrates how a process will influence an environment for users to understand the benefits of change and the incremental efforts that take place to allow them to experience these changes and acceptance. So, I mean, I think we all echo Doug's comment. Y'all are doing a great job at City of Fort Worth in this Complete Streets program. So we appreciate you coming and presenting it to us, Julia.
Yeah, thank you so much.
If there are no other questions for Julia, we'll just close out here, and I want to thank everyone for joining our webinar. Thank you, Julia, again for your time this afternoon. I also want to again thank our sponsors for the Fort Worth website: BGE, Kimley Horn, LAN, Pacheco Coke, Paradigm Traffic Systems, and Telco. And as a reminder, recording and PDHs will be available on the website here in a few days. So I think that's it. I don't see any more questions coming in. So I appreciate everybody joining today's webinar, and have a great day.